I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. Today we'll be talking about lesson 22 of our study, which covers the Gospel according to John, chapter 18, verse 28, through chapter 19, verse 16. We are now picking up in the middle of a very interesting and exciting is probably not quite the right word considering what we know the end result is, but I'm going to say it anyway. Nonetheless, kind of exciting if you're into politics and power struggles and that kind of thing situation here, where we've got a number of different parties involved. We've got Jesus, we've got Jesus' followers who are notably mostly absent, but do count as far as this discussion goes and is going to go. And they count as a separate entity from Jesus himself. So we'll have to keep all of that in mind. Then we've got the Jewish leaders. And we've got the Romans. And finally we've got the overall crowd. And the interplay between all of these different elements is going to shape not only Jesus' fate, but as it turns out, the fate of us all. And Jesus is manipulating, and has been for years, all of these different parties into this one particular outcome. One of the important points and the overarching important point I want us to focus on as we go through these next couple of lessons is that this is not a tragedy in the sense we've talked a little bit about the Gospel according to John kind of being modeled on Greek tragedy, which I think is a case that can be fairly strongly made. Except here in the ending, the Greek tragedies you have people trying to do good things and then factors outside of their control coming into play, and bad things end up happening to them despite their best efforts or intentions much of the time. And then it ends badly. This is the opposite of that in two key ways, at least. The first being, this is in no way, shape, or form out of Jesus' control at any point in time. Everything that is happening can be perceived as bad, but it is not accidental or coincidental at all. It is deliberately contrived and set up by Jesus, even though everyone thinks that they're some people at least think they're kind of getting one over on him. Second of all, it's not bad. Jesus is choosing this deeply unpleasant, sad, and horrific thing because ultimately it's good, which we will for sure come back to because we're not quite, to where we all know this is going yet. For now, where we're picking up is in the middle of how we get from innocent Jesus to capital penalty. And we've seen previously Jesus has been, let's not say arrested, strictly speaking, so much as apprehended. It was done, we saw, at night by soldiers, but with no, this is the sort of arrest that if it were done today would be done without a warrant, right? It's basically thugs coming and grabbing Jesus and then bypassing due process thus far. He was seen by the high priest at night, and after being seen by the high priest's father-in-law, who doesn't actually have a specific position enabling him to a legal position, making him the one who should be seeing a legally obtained prisoner. And the whole project has been, of the Jewish leaders so far, has been, We finally have a way to catch this guy. We have caught him. Now we have to figure out how to punish him because we haven't actually caught him in a way that is immediately punishable under the law that we're going to say is so important to us. We don't have witnesses. We're not conducting a trial, but we need Jesus to die. And because of this big kind of mostly silent player in all of this, the crowd, we also have to not be the ones to do it because the crowd is still more or less on the side of Jesus. So we need anybody who ends up being sore about Jesus being put to death to blame not us, but the Romans. So we're in a position, we're not wanting to go through a formal legal process, even if we could kill him ourselves, which we can't because of the law. The Roman rules, or even if we're supposed to, we don't want to go through any of those channels because all of them lead to us punishing Jesus. And any version of us punishing Jesus could draw the ire of the crowd, who's still very pro-Jesus. So our whole plan so far has been find enough about Jesus that we can pass him off to Rome, which is where we're at now. So the previous conversations with Jesus, short as they were centered around trying to find enough to bring before Rome. And you're going to have very different accusations against Jesus if you're trying to kill him under your Jewish law than you do if you're trying to get the Romans to kill him. There are sensitive areas and topics that cases you could make against Jesus, but they're different ones for different sides. What's the worst thing you can do to offend a Jew? There's that first commandment, which is really a big deal. The one about I am the Lord your God, right? It's not quite the commandment, but the idea of one God. You shall have no other gods before me. That's it, God. One, only God is like the root and core and foundation of Jewish identity. And everything flows from that. So anything along the lines of challenging that is deeply offensive to a Jewish idea of right and wrong, and touches on blasphemy and is capital punishment. But they're not doing that right now. Why not? Because again, they're not trying to put him to death. We're going to get over here to, we've got to get to the Roman side of it. What do Romans hate more than just about anything? Going back to the early days of the Roman Republic, the founding of the Roman Republic, they hate kings. It's the idea of a king is extremely anti-Roman. Although now, at this point in history, they've kind of evolved to have these Caesar emperors, basically, but they very explicitly don't use the title king because something about king is still deeply offensive to Romans. And something about anyone challenging Roman authority is also deeply offensive to Romans. So the idea of Jesus being a king is the sore spot to Romans. So they have a lot of different things they can try to do. What they're starting with here is they're going down the Roman path, and they're trying to get Pilate to deal with this. And I think a strong case can be made that they're doing it because of the crowd. And that's where we pick up today, is we see in this verse, they take Jesus, it's early in the morning, right? They grabbed him at night. They're waiting. It's not even, as we'll see in a little while, the Praetorium's not even open for official legal business yet. Pilate's not sitting in the judgment seat yet. They're getting in ahead of that early. And because of the timing of all of this, the Praetorium's in Jerusalem, but it's a building that's, because it's where Roman business is conducted, it makes you unclean to go there. And again, we've talked about the timeline already. We're coming up on this series of this feast period that cannot be celebrated by those who are unclean, and these are religious leaders. Part of their job is officiating over these feasts. So they're trying to turn Jesus over to Pilate, and it's this hilarious situation where they have to wait at the door while they turn him over, which provides an opportunity for Jesus and Pilate to have a private conversation, which otherwise wouldn't have happened, right? On a normal day, Pilate wouldn't have been there because he wouldn't have been in Jerusalem without the feast. But they also, had he been there, they would have gone in and participated more directly in more of this conversation. But because of the pending feast, we get a side conversation between Jesus and Pilate as well. All just extremely fascinating how all of this ends up playing out. So they bring Jesus to Pilate, they wait outside, they send Jesus in. And that's a lot for one verse. As everyone arrives then at the Praetorium, Pilate comes out to meet them initially to figure out what's going on. And the relevant question, basically, why am I involved in this? Right? You guys, more or less, have the ability to administer your own government and your own justice. You say this guy's a criminal, okay, handle it, right? Which is a reasonable point. And we've seen they don't want to handle it because they don't want to be the ones punishing Jesus, which leads to this exchange. What accusation do you bring against him? He's bad. Scout's honor. If he weren't bad, we wouldn't be bringing him to you. That's not an accusation. That's vagary. And again, not formally charged with a crime at this point, right? In the Gospel according to John, Jesus is never convicted of any crime. We see in some of the synoptics via false witnesses, a trial period where you could argue Jesus actually is convicted, although through false means. In John's Gospel, and he's the one who was there, not convicted actually formally of any crime. And here you can see, what charge do you have? He's a bad guy. Not he claimed to be king, not he claimed to be God, not people like him better than us. Just he's a bad guy. And Pilate says, cool, go deal with that then. Why are you bringing this mysteriously bad guy to me at all? Pilate likewise doesn't want to be involved in the punishing Jesus business, right? Everyone's in town for the feast. It's a big deal. Jesus is a very polarizing figure. A lot of people on his side. Remember, he just rode into town a few days ago to a big hullabaloo, and everybody was very worked up and excited and very pro-Jesus. Pilate is a career politician. He knows as well as anybody else, as well as the Jews, that it's going to be kind of bad news for anybody who ends up punishing Jesus. And so his thought is, you do it. And now we've got this game of, we've caught this guy apparently. Somebody needs to deal with the consequences if we've caught him. And it's the Jews saying, Pilate, do it. And Pilate saying, you guys do it. And that's going to be kind of a back and forth finger pointing, trying to not be the one stuck holding Jesus and having to deal ultimately with Jesus. And so what do they come back with? We can't punish him by our law because your law prevents it. Because the punishment for being a bad guy is apparently death. So you have to punish him for his being evil by putting him to death for us because you don't let us do that. Couple lines of thinking here. There's a question as to how much they really wanted to put Jesus to death versus how much that's the way they could put this punishment on Pilate. I think probably it's fair to say, because John's told us many times, they've been looking explicitly for a way to put him to death, right? So we can say, yes, they want to kill him. But it likewise could have been the only way we can justify turning him over to Rome to deal with here in this scenario is if something needs to happen that Rome won't let us do, then it necessitates Rome getting involved. It's a way to, so it's also a very convenient way to push him off on Pilate. But we do know from the text multiple other times that they've been very actively trying explicitly to kill Jesus. So the two ends are working very well together here, I would say. Again, still no charge, just bad guy, but apparently being a bad guy is a capital crime in Jerusalem in the 30s CE AD. Here again with this verse, I think John probably put this in so that we as the audience can be tracking Jesus is not out of control, right? He's in custody. It can look like things are happening very quickly. It can look like these, in theory, powerful people are controlling the fate of, in theory, less powerful Jesus. But he has already said multiple times, if you look at the 3rd and 12th chapters, in the gospel, Jesus has already said he's going to be lifted up, right? That's how he's going to die, foreshadowing explicitly crucifixion. That's not how, if the Jews did have the ability to put him to death for, let's say, blasphemy, it would be stoning, it wouldn't be crucifixion. Crucifixion is a Roman punishment. So Jesus has actually foretold the manner of his death as a Roman execution. We didn't talk about it a lot back then because we all know he's crucified. We didn't really dwell on it as explicitly Roman, but it is an explicitly Roman thing. So here, the Jews handing him over to Pilate to deal with is a thing Jesus knew was going to happen from way before it happened, and again, didn't stop. If you're omnipotent, choosing to not stop something is the same as allowing it to happen. Right? If you are, like the rest of us, limited in what you can do, then it's a much grayer area. But if you have absolute power over everything that goes on and foreknowledge that it's going to happen, and you choose not to intervene, then you are making it happen. In a way that when I choose not to act, I don't necessarily explicitly make what ends up happening happen, because I'm not in control of all the other factors and I don't actually know what the result is going to be. So in that case, if I were to not act, what happens as a result of that can fairly be seen as accident. But an omniscient, omnipotent God, it's a whole different ballgame. By Jesus not stopping this, he is condoning it. He's enabling it. So, key takeaway, this is not out of Jesus' control. And he is choosing this outcome. We saw Pilate come out for the handoff of Jesus, and this super vague conversation about what Jesus did wrong. Now, Jesus and Pilate have gone in where the others can't follow. So now Pilate gets to have this one-on-one conversation with Jesus about what's going on. What are Pilate's goals in this conversation? He's had this guy handed over. He knows that the Jews want him dead. Pilate's not exactly in an easy spot politically. He's sort of torn in this Jesus scenario between the will of the Jewish leaders, his perception of the will of the crowd, what he thinks personally is right. There are a lot of things going on. Initially, he needs to do some fact-finding. What actually has this guy done? Is he guilty of anything? How do I feel about this whole scenario? Unlike Jewish law, where you have trials and you have like kind of a criminal justice system and witnesses and some of those things, Pilate pretty much can do what he wants. As the Roman governor, if he thinks somebody should be put to death, that's kind of final word on that, and that is the thing that can happen. So it's a, again, different legal process, as we'll see play out. If Pilate decides go for it, then that's sufficient. Another convenient reason for the Jews to want Pilate to do it is there is no burden of proof. There's only burden of bullying Pilate into choosing to let that happen, which is sort of where this goes. So, what does Pilate think would be a reason that Jesus should die? Again, Pilate being a Roman, if Jesus has made himself a king, then that is a problem that we cannot allow. These people have rebelled before. You know, I've heard about this Messiah thing that they think they want, and my understanding of that is that that is a king in all of the ways that Rome can't put up with. If they're rebelling and getting behind this guy and saying he has political authority and Rome doesn't, and he's going to raise an army and fight us, then absolutely, let's kill him right now, no problem. And I agree with these Jews who handed him over and said he's a bad guy. But what kind of king is he asking him if he is? He's very explicitly asking if he's the king of the guys who just handed him over, the king of the Jews. Why would they, if that were true, why would they be doing that? Which is, I think, the root of Pilate's question is, the only king that would be a problem to me for you to be is the one that they wouldn't be doing this if you were, because they'd be glad for that. Or they're really sycophantic toward me in Rome, which these guys aren't. I know these guys aren't. So what's going on here? King of the Jews? Are you that? And now for a little while, this power play and this interchange of power dynamics is going to shift from guilt and charges and accusations to conflicting ideas of what a king is. And it's all, everything that's been, the whole interchange that's been floating around the criminal justice idea of charges and Jesus' guilt is going to be reframed with a similar dynamic on the question of what is a king. And again, you've got three different perspectives on what is a king that are going to be at play in this conversation. This is the first one we see play out. Pilate is putting Jesus in the bucket of what do those guys, the Jews, see as a king, and is that who Jesus is? And what does Jesus say? Well, Pilate, where are you getting this idea, right? Is this your idea of me being a king, or are other people telling you that this is me being a king? Where is this idea of me being a king coming from? Note, Jesus does not say no, because he's not going to lie. And there is a sense in which the answer to that question is yes. Yes, I am the king of the Jews, right? Jesus is the promised Messiah. He is a king of these people. He is not the version of it that Pilate means, however. So the answer is yes, but it's way better to not say that when that could be a capital crime. An admission of something that actually could lead to a guilty charge. Jesus does not walk into the trap of, yeah, I am that. And Pilate saying, oh, easy then, yeah, you're dead. Instead he says, what do you think that means, right? Where is this idea coming from? Let's figure out, what do you think that means? I'm not saying yes or no. And that's where we've gotten so far. Continuing this idea of the kingship of Jesus, Pilate responds back with, am I a Jew, right? This view of you being king of the Jews, that's not my view of that is outside of me as a Roman, right? Like, this is all your business. You all Jews lumped together, including you, Jesus, in the category of Jews. If you're a king, you're the king of the Jews. You're definitely not a Roman king. Again, trying to shove him in a box that's not actionable by death. If he's just the king of the Jews, especially based on the way that they've handed him over themselves, he's outside of the need for Roman punishment, capital punishment, because he's clearly not been acknowledged by the Jews as they handed him over. He's not running anything. He has no political authority. These other guys are still in charge. He has no soldiers that he's bossing around. Pilate's shoving Jesus back into a non-Roman category to try to shove the Jesus problem back onto the Jewish leaders. And in so doing, he's putting Jesus in the Jewish bucket, whereas the Jewish leaders are trying to put Jesus in the Roman bucket. Again, everybody's trying to shove Jesus over into this other bucket and control the narrative, because whoever best controls the narrative is the one who has to make the other person deal with Jesus. And everybody's trying to get Jesus to go along with whatever narrative they're trying to create. And Pilate thinks he's got him here. Jesus will surely agree with me that this is an issue with these guys, because they're handing him over, and he's probably not exactly happy with that whole situation. And if I can get him to rant and rail against these guys, pretty much, I'm getting him to implicitly admit that, yes, he's involved in all of this, and this is a Jewish problem. And then you guys all go deal with it. And, you know, in a very different and better sense, I get to wash my hands of all of this before it gets to be anything I have to deal with. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus refuses to allow himself to be categorized as a Jew. My kingship is not he doesn't say, again, not a king. He says, not the king of the Jews. And does say king. But also not of this world, not Roman king either. Right? Jesus is saying it's neither of those things. I'm not the kind of king that you're worried about. I'm definitely not their king, as is clearly evidenced by the fact that they're not on my team. There are a few guys who are on my team who, at least one was notably willing to do what I'm describing, fight to keep me from being handed over, but that's not what we're doing now, so I stopped him. And he listened because, you know, he's actually my subject. There are some people who are. But it's not centered here. It's not where you all are. It's not Roman. It's not Jewish. It's a different thing on a different plane. It's not what you think it is. But yeah, totally king. But try to convict me for being a king who has no political authority in this world. That's what you care about. So I will say, yes, I'm a king, not lying, but I'll say it in a way that now that we're sort of understanding some terms, you're still not going to find guilt in. So Pilate, back on you. Figure out how to handle that. Pilate, correctly picking up on the narrative, so you are admitting, Jesus, that you are a king. I didn't just miss that. That's what you said, right? Seeking confirmation. Because that's a big deal. His whole starting line of questioning was basically, are you a king? And then Jesus said, my kingdom's not of this world. To have a kingdom, you are a king. Pilate is not a dummy. Not that it would be too hard to miss that, but it's a weird statement. He pulled the most relevant thing out of it for what he's trying to do. So Jesus, if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying, yes, you are a king. Is that right? Jesus' response. You're the one who brought up the idea of kings. I mean, by some definition thereof, what does that mean? What do I mean by my kingdom? Because I never said I was a king. And I'm still not saying that. I came here from not here, and truth is the thing that I'm about. His reign is not of authority, but of truth, which is an odd thing. Not of power, even. Although, I mean, he has, like, clearly has power. But, you know, worldly kingdoms, how you define king is, it is the guy who has power. How Jesus is defining king is he's the guy who has truth. And he came to bring it here from not here. But he's presenting himself as not belonging here, right? So Jews, Romans, whatever, all of you people here, I'm visiting. This is not my home. And so this is not my kingdom. And whatever thing you think, how can you incriminate, like, I'm a visiting dignitary, right? I'm an ambassador from my kingdom of heaven. You don't kill ambassadors who are visiting your kingdom to bring to you something from the news from theirs. In this case, truth. I am a dignitary. So take from that what you will. I came to bring you a message, specifically truth, which you all seem to be sorely lacking. As we can tell from this conversation, none of you even seems to grasp what a king is. So, like, if I made myself a king of Roman-controlled lands, yeah, off with his head, right? But I'm not. I'm a king of a different land where Rome doesn't have sway, because Rome might rule most of the known world, but heaven isn't in the known world. I'm an ambassador, and you don't kill ambassadors. So, back to you, Pilate. Pilate is now, obviously, flummoxed a little bit. Pilate's trying to talk about justice and power, and Jesus is talking about, and life and death for that matter, and Jesus is talking about truth. Out of the blue, really that's not been, while one would hope that criminal justice proceedings wherein life and death are on the line, are very much concerned with the idea of truth. Practically speaking, that is not so in this case, right? Nobody's trying to get to the bottom of Pilate more than anybody, but even he's not really trying to get to the bottom of what is true here. He's trying to get to the bottom, he's trying to create a political narrative as much as the other side is, right? Everybody's trying to create a truth, not trying to find a truth. And so, faced with somebody who's saying, well, okay, but this is what's real here. If you care, Pilate, this is what's real here. So, figure that out. Then Pilate is basically coming back with, real? We're not, huh? What's that? Which looks a little funny initially, but we do this. When you're surrounded by falsehood or lies of convenience or those self-deceptions that make us feel a little bit better about ourselves or whatever for long enough, that becomes your reality. Right? It's unreal things become the filter through which you view the world, and you see the world in an unreal way. And to you, that seems accurate. We're all susceptible to it, and I suspect everyone watching this video, unless we have some saints watching it, in which case, please pray for me, has some versions of not being able to see things truly and clearly. And when confronted with things that provide challenge or dissonance to that false worldview we've created, how do we respond to it? The very easy thing to do, and convenient again, is to dismiss those things that are challenging. And to push back, especially if they claim something as preposterous as absolute objective truth. Well, that's not a thing. Yeah, sure, in general, you definitely should never kill anyone. But in particular, I can't deal with having this child right now. I'm young, I don't have any money, this will ruin my life. So in general, yeah, here's a principle, that's great. In particular, it's just not a thing that I can accept. And so I have to push away this objective idea and to accept a more convenient view of how the world has to be. Then what do I do when dissonance comes in? I say, there's not such a thing as this objective right and wrong thing. It's more complicated than that. And the truth becomes how I need it to be to get by with how I perceive I have to do things. And it's not so, we shouldn't be quick to judge the people who do that. The example I just gave is one where I'm pretty quick to judge sometimes. But we all do versions of this trick where we just allow a distortion of the idea that there can be a true and objective and real thing and principle to follow. And in Christianity, it's a step more, because we're not ignoring a what, we're ignoring a who. Jesus is the truth, right? We see in John all these statements, I am, he has said, the way, the life, and the truth. This isn't like Plato's forms, like you have this weird idea of tableness floating out in the heavens that corresponds to a table. It's not a what that's a not real thing. It's a who that is a very real thing. It is the God of the universe. And these principles are not arbitrary. They are good. And they make us good. And we've talked about sin in the Gospel according to John and in the New Testament is an idea of missing the mark, right? We veer away from specifically what's true and right and real. And you can veer just a little bit, right? And if you keep veering just a little bit, you can end up very, very, very far from straight, from the right line. And it's a thing that happens, and it's a thing that we do. And it's a thing that had happened to all of humanity. That's the human condition, is falsehood had mingled so much with the way humans saw things that people didn't know what was right or real anymore. And they didn't have the referent, right? They didn't have truth as a referent that they could go back to, because it's not an abstract thing. It's a who, not a what. But we've lost our relationship and our ability to commune and to talk with God. So Jesus brought to restore truth, that's why he's not just a teacher saying, do this, don't do that. He brought him, not rules. Which is the great irony of Pilate's statement here, what is truth? He's not asking quite the right question. The right question is, who is truth? But he doesn't understand truth enough to see that, or to see that he's saying it to the guy who is truth, the only guy at this point in the history of humanity, at this point still today also, that you could say that about. Who is truth? Truth is Jesus Christ, the God and the man, all one together. He is saying what is truth to truth itself. But we do that. And he's not unique in that. We all do that in one form or another. Jesus, are you sure about whatever thing that I don't want to have be real, because then my life would have to be different? I don't know about that. All the time we're missing just a little bit. And the constant call to repentance of the Christian life is to be trying to find where we're missing and to try to reconcile that and to get back towards straight, right? And that's the thing that faith is meant to help us do in this gospel, is it moves us directionally toward Jesus. It's accepting truth is not a function of the intellect. It's a function of the will. It's trust. It's I choose to trust God more than me because he's trustworthy, because he's true. And I'm not, and I know I'm not. So why am I going to trust me more than God? And every time we choose to trust God more than to rely on me, we step a little bit outside of that distortion of falsehood that we all create within ourselves, right? Jesus said at the beginning of all this period of talking that we all have to die to ourselves. That's part of what that is I have to accept that my view of things is not it. And I have to be willing to say, this is all I know and this is how I see the world, and I'm going to disregard it because I believe there's a better thing. And I'm going to trust God enough to disregard my view of things because it's clearly not adequate anyway. And Jesus has promised me something more. And I know Jesus enough to trust that I can take this next step. And every time we do that, we move a little bit closer back onto the right track, or also, as the gospel according to John has told us, from the darkness into the light, right? We can come to see more and more clearly the more we do that. Or we can say, truth, what's that? That's not consistent with my narrative. So you leave that thing over here, and I'll stick here with my view. Two significant things happening here. The first, again, this has been another round of potential sentencing, right? Jews handed Jesus off to Pilate to judge and to carry out a sentence against. Pilate comes out and says, all right, first of all, so we're all straight, I haven't found evidence that this guy has done anything wrong. So in my position as absolute word on this, nothing wrong. Second, and this is where Pilate makes a misstep. He thinks he's doing Jesus a favor, right? He thinks he's found a way to get the crowd involved and to let this guy go. But to do so, there has to be some, and they have a custom, you let somebody in custody go every year at this time, one person. The trick is, you don't let an innocent person go in this context, because you should just let an innocent person go. Anyone in your custody, by posing, we can just let Jesus go per the custom, he's assuming some guilt. So while he comes out and says, I don't think this guy's guilty, but here's a category we can put him in that assumes that he's guilty, that it's a misstep with what he's trying to do. What does he think could happen? The crowd is still pretty pro-Jesus. He thinks that's going to be a very popular move. When is this all happening? It is very, very early. The crowd is not up yet. Who's up and around? All the people conspiring to put Jesus to death. So everyone around is in favor of, let's not do that. We don't want to let Jesus go because we're trying to have him killed and that's too easy. So no, don't let Jesus go. But yes, thank you for admitting that he's a criminal. We agree. So keep him in custody. You have now given up the pathway where you say he's not guilty, I'm letting him go, of my authority. Again, Pilate doesn't want to do that either, because everybody's worried. There's also the anti-Jesus part of the crowd. Pilate's trying to shift the burden off of him onto this rule. He thinks he has a clever way. I'll let Jesus go and it won't be my fault. So the people who do think he's a problem can't pin it on me either. But what he does instead is ends up implicitly assigning guilt to Jesus without ever pronouncing him guilty. So now you have somebody who is implicitly a criminal still in your custody because you've refused to just let him go and have categorized him under tradition, but not under formal sentencing yet, as a criminal. Whoops. It's not what he was trying to do. His intentions were good. And this is what happens. It's a fantastic transition. This is what happens when truth isn't what matters. Is if you're trying to shape the most convenient narrative to get to the outcome you want, and situations get out of control because someone else tells a better lie than you do. And it's all about what can you get people to believe and not about what is true. And now you have everyone buying in to the premise that Jesus is a criminal. Or you have a strong enough case and optics that Jesus is a criminal. You have accidentally fed into the false narrative of the criminality of Jesus enough that it has become true. Even though no sentence has ever been passed. No trial has ever been had. You just said before that, I don't find any crime, and nonetheless, by the narrative and the optics of the situation, Jesus is now a criminal. See how that happened? That is a weird thing. And when we talk about who this all gets away from, right? It does get out of control. It doesn't get out of Jesus' control. But this is the whole thing spinning badly out of Pilate's control. He got outmaneuvered by the Jewish leaders pretty significantly. And he, from this point on, he has lost. And he lost. This is the losing move on his part. It has yet to play out, and he'll still try, but this is the point at which it turned, and he gave the ground needed for them to bring the thing home. This is where he lost, and he no longer has the ability to take control of the narrative back, as we'll see. What now? Again, we see Pilate's been outmaneuvered into this category of Jesus as not innocent, although also not guilty. So what does he do? He clearly still doesn't want to deal with Jesus, but he now has to do something. So he decides to have him searched. He's still thinking, all right, I'll beat him up and I'll humiliate him, and it'll be enough to satisfy enough of my base that I've, not soft on crime, not soft on fake kings. We punish people who are clearly guilty of ? Not a pushover. Because we've said that he did wrong things, whatever those are. He's evil, whatever. He's having to buy into the same vague narrative that the Jews brought him initially, that he's just bad. Because again, no crime. He's being punished for the vagary of bad. So Pilate has him searched. And doesn't particularly like that he's doing so. But doesn't really have a way around it. And is increasingly frustrated with these Jewish leaders. And so he makes another decision, I think, to try to get a little bit of leverage back here. Again, what kind of king is Jesus? They want Pilate to kill Jesus because he's a king. He's saying, I'm not going to kill him. And he's saying, by the way, I'm going to dress him up like a king and call him the king of the Jews and hand him back to you as your king whom I have beaten. If I have to beat this guy, I'm going to make it about you, and I'm going to make him a symbol of you when I do it. Pilate's now then giving Jesus back to the Jews and getting one over on them. This is going to be your king that I'm going to humiliate and beat. So, yeah, you've annoyed me. You seem to be winning this little bit of exchange, but here's my chance to get a little bit back. I have to punish this guy anyway. I'm going to make him a symbol of you when I do it. At the same time, it now doesn't hurt me to admit that he's the king of the Jews, because I've said no crime, not capital. Pilate's not foreseeing a way in which, especially after he beats and humiliates Jesus, that leads to Jesus' death. So he's been outmaneuvered so far in terms of Jesus' criminality, but not to the level of capital crime yet. And he thinks he has a way to both get one over on the Jews and diffuse the situation about Jesus. So he can acknowledge he's the king of the Jews. He can do it in a way that is not threatening, right? He's not opposed to Rome if he's being mocked and beaten by Rome. And again, by making him king of the Jews, when all these Jewish leaders are the ones annoying him, he can say, here's your king, have fun with that, guys. And, I've dealt with what I needed to do on that. So he's guilty of some abstract wickedness, but we can let him go now because we've clearly beaten that out of him. So he... it kind of reads a little bit like, if you're not paying attention, like the soldiers do this, like just because they're bored or something. No, they're definitely following orders, right? This is Pilate's orchestration. Soldiers don't have expensive purple robes lying around. Purple dye was very expensive back then. Pilate's investing in this, probably of his own resources. The other thing, crown of thorns, is, we tend to think of crowns by the medieval standard of, I've got a big gold hat band with gems and things in it. The Romans didn't do crowns that way either. They did like bands of laurels. It was a different plant, but a crown of thorns is much more similar to a Roman crown than we might initially think, as we tend to see the more medieval version of a crown. So, yeah, it is an inversion or a mockery of an idea of how Romans would do a head dressing for a king, but it's way more similar than we might initially think. So, Pilate, having done all of that, brings Jesus back out to everyone, the crowd again. Remember, they still can't go into the Praetorium. So Pilate has beaten Jesus and dressed him up. Now he's bringing them back out and dressed as a king. Guys, here's your king. I took care of it. I'm done with this guy. Now we can all agree this is over. I'm done with this guy. Here he is. And Pilate thinks that's solved. And the king issue, he's gained a lot of leverage on the king issue, right? He's made it harmless. He's made any notion of Jesus' kingship a harmless thing from the Roman perspective. He has a point. It could be done there. But the maneuvering's not over yet. Again, picking up, Pilate has successfully diffused the king situation. The Jewish leaders know they can't shove him back to Pilate and again say, also they don't want to explicitly say he's the king of the Jews. There's a reason they never brought it up before. If they say that, they're acknowledging that he's their king, which they're not going to do. So they were hoping Pilate would get there himself through rumors and innuendo and vagary. Pilate did go down that road, and this is where it has led. That charge is not going to do it. It got Jesus beat, it didn't get Jesus killed. So now they have to figure out something else. So Pilate hands him back, and they say, crucify him. Right? They were looking for Pilate to say that. Pilate didn't kill him. Now they're trying to tell Pilate what to do again. And Pilate is saying, why? Again, not guilty. This kingship thing isn't a bother for me. I see no problem. Why would I do that? And they say, well, that's your law. That's why you have to kill people. Our law doesn't care if he's a king or not. Not saying he's our king. Definitely not saying that. Let's move on from the king question, because he's not our king. You didn't just beat and humiliate our king. That's definitely not what happened. He's not that. He is a guy who is a blasphemer. If we're going to do this, now we have to fall back to plan B. He is a blasphemer who said he's God. And that is not tolerable. And the only possible, not said he was, made himself the Son of God. What an interesting charge. Again, you could argue that Jesus is, in fact, guilty of making himself the Son of God in the very literal sense that he is the Son of God, and had something to do with making himself a person. You could argue that this is accurate. The problem is the charge is only problematic if it's not accurate, right? Like, he has to, the part they don't say, he has to have falsely made himself the Son of God, not truly made himself the Son of God. If, again, that truth thing that Jesus claimed before is a defense against this. If Jesus is truly the Son of God, then that's not blasphemy. That's just, he's God. But what they're suggesting is blasphemy. They're assuming that it's impossible that Jesus is God. Even though Jesus has had repeatedly this conversation with them, look at the things I'm doing. People, let that speak for me. How do you determine someone's from God? Oh, they do and say the things that I do and say. Oh, but I'm not? Why not? Open your eyes, right? He's talked to them repeatedly about witness and testimony to the fact that what he's saying and what he's doing are true. And they're in exactly the same spot as Pilate. Well, how do you know what's true? How do you know what's good? All we know is the thing that you said can't be true because that's way too uncomfortable for us. And so it must be that when you say that you're the Son of God, you're lying. We're not going to provide counter proof to the fact that you're lying. It's just that has to be what it is. That can't be a real thing. So, or we're in a lot of trouble. So it's not. We're just assuming that it's false when you make yourself the Son of God. But the part that makes it a guilty thing is just assumed still. It's still just assumed that it's false. They don't even say he blasphemed. They just said he made himself the Son of God, which is an accurate thing that he did in fact do. Because he is. But it's only a crime if it's false. And they don't bring up that part. So they've shifted the narrative here on Pilate, who has dealt with the king thing, but he has not yet dealt with the blasphemy thing. And it's not really Roman practice to kill people for blasphemy, right? That's Jewish business. They're having to default from Roman law back to theirs, because the attempt to do it all within the Roman context, Pilate won on his ground, right? He's the Roman. He knows the Roman ways of doing things. He won entirely on Roman turf. So the Jews are having to play a little bit on their turf, which they were hoping not to do. But they had this fallback position. And this is making Pilate, again, very, very nervous, because he's noticed that this guy is unusual. And unlike the Jews, he's not immediately willing to write off the fact that that could be real. He was able to look Jesus in the eye and say, what is truth? But he's not willing to immediately buy into the assumption. Like, on the Roman side, he was very willing to dismiss any idea that the truth and reality of Jesus' kingship can be a thing, right? just like on the Jewish side, they do the same thing to his godhood. Right? Each one of them is rejecting the thing that's most dissonant with their view of the world and willing to accept the other. The Jews could accept Jesus, they don't, but they could accept Jesus as king, never as God. Pilate could accept Jesus as God, never as king. Which is just super interesting. So Pilate here is afraid because in the Roman mentality, there are tons of gods. This dude could be one. What happens if I try to kill him and he decides to start throwing lightning bolts at all of us? He doesn't. Pilate's understanding of what God isn't the same as Jesus, but he's at least open to the possibility that maybe that is accurate. And as a result of that, he is getting extremely nervous. There's a lot here. First point, Pilate being fearful that Jesus might actually be a god. How do you find that out about somebody? You don't ask them if they're a god. Because there's a strong likelihood even back then that somebody's going to think you're crazy if you ask them if they're a god, right? It's just, that's not how you talk to people. But it's entered Pilate's mind that, I don't know, this guy's pretty weird, and he was making some interesting claims before, and I've heard about some of the things he's done. Where did you say you're from again, Jesus? And again, Jesus is not going to lie through any part of this. And if he says heaven, or even interpreted as the skies, the Romans would likewise interpret that as where gods are from. Imagine what happens if Pilate actually starts to truly believe that Jesus is a god. That backfires pretty hard for the Jews as well. But that's not what Jesus still has an out right here that the Jews gave him. He could just say, yes, I'm from heaven, and I am a god. And here, let me turn your glass of water into some good wine, and then let's go have a party and laugh at those guys while you let me go. And pretty much something like that would likely happen. And Jesus would very likely soon have Roman sponsorship as a god in that region. And tourism would sure pick up, and it would be a whole different series of events, right? Jesus could very likely find himself in a different kind of position of authority as well, especially if he played ball with Rome, which of course he has no interest in doing. And he has a very different plan. But he can't lie. So what does he do? He says nothing. And that leads Pilate to say, come on, guy. I have all the power here. Who has the power here? First of all, and above everybody else, Jesus. Second of all, the Jews are ahead right now. They have more power than Pilate does. Pilate is the least powerful person right now in this whole exchange. And he's falling back to, I have the power, talk to me. And he just doesn't, right? He's blustering at this point, and clearly he's very frustrated, right? He should be. He's having a bad day. And that's what Jesus basically tells him is, look, you're going along with this, you're complicit, you are not without guilt. But this is also, a lot of this is happening out of your hands. Don't worry too much about it. You are actually trying, and I can see that, and you're getting bullied by people who are outplaying you. They're more guilty than you are. But yeah, you also are choosing to go along with this for the sake of expediency and convenience. So yeah, not good for you either, but way worse for them. There, buddy. This really isn't Jesus. This really is Jesus kind of trying to sympathize with or comfort Pilate just a little bit. I think we can look so badly down on Pilate, but this just got away from him. He's trying to be a decent administrator. He's trying to do the right thing as he sees it to the best of his ability, and he is just getting extremely outmaneuvered. And, in no point is he willing to stand up on the objective principle of right and say, I have to let this go because right is more important than playing politics here. He is still a politician, and he got swept away by not ever quite being able to stand up and say, there is a right thing. Won't get into it too much, but you can argue that the same thing still happens very much in politics today and has throughout all of human history. I think you can cite a lot of examples of that. It's easy to start choosing a side over what's right, either or any side, and to lose sight of there's a right thing. There is an objectively right and true thing, and once you've done that, how are you ever going to find your bearing again? And that's where we kind of are with Pilate. And Jesus does feel a little bad for him, but also recognizes the power you actually have, Pilate, is you could do the right thing at any point in time here. The objectively right thing, but that's not what you're going to do. And within that context, you're still trying, and you're getting outmaneuvered. So we see Pilate still looking for a way to release Jesus. And now the narrative shifts again. They tried to get he said he's a God thing. That didn't get them anywhere with Pilate. They have one move left. And that's the one that's going to work. Which is, we're going to tell on you. You have now called this guy publicly a king, beat him for being a proclaimed king. You can't let him go. We're going to tell the Romans that there's a guy who made himself a king that you didn't kill. And they're going to not like that you didn't kill him, because that's what you Romans do with kings. By trying to diffuse the situation, you had to rub it in with us and crown him as a king and call him the King of the Jews, which you had to take that cheap shot. Well, now it's out there, and you've called him the King of the Jews publicly. So now you have to kill him, or we're going to tell on you. Because Rome will not have more than one king in their lands. It will not happen. So Pilate, what are you going to do about it? And that's when Pilate says, you win, right? Let's go. I'm going to pass judgment. I can't not kill him now. He got backed into a corner. They're right. Once he's publicly called him king, he's going to get in just a ton of... His career is over if he lets a guy go who's made himself a king. And having threatened to tell on him, he knows they're going to do it, right? He either has to kill Jesus or everyone else, which isn't going to... also doesn't bode well for his career. He's backed himself into this corner. He now has to kill Jesus. And note that it happened because he was willing to do things that aren't real to try to get to an outcome that he thought was better, right? He compromised. He was willing to, and tried to poke fun a little bit, but he was willing to, knowing that Jesus is not really the King of the Jews, but thinking that it got him better to his outcome, to use a falsehood to get to the truth than to stay with the objective reality of the situation. He got himself into a position where it just all got away from him. In a way that it never would if he had stuck entirely with the truth. But it certainly wasn't as convenient for him to do that. And he'd have taken a lot more... He was trying to dodge taking heat, and he ended up instead here. So he sits down on the judgment seat. Time. It was the 6th hour. We've talked about it a little bit before. One more time we will. We've heard before this is taking place in the morning. In the Gospel according to John, this timing is Roman. It follows Roman time, which is the same as ours. The 6th hour being 6 a.m., not being like 6 hours after sunrise, which would be Hebrew time. All of this has still been morning. This is 6 a.m. is when business opens, official legal Roman business. They got Jesus there basically before the courts opened and hashed all this out, so that now, as the courts are opening, they've won. Pilate basically sits on his judge's seat and says, "I condemn you," right? What does he condemn him to? And who ends up actually killing Jesus is an interesting thing as well. So he sits in judgment, which basically he is saying guilty of making himself the king, but he doesn't kill him. We saw from Jesus capturing that Roman soldiers are willing to follow. Due to the nature of this arrangement, the Roman soldiers, within some capacity, are willing to follow the orders of the Jewish leadership. It must be some of how that government was set up and how the arrangement between the Jews and the Romans tended to work. Pilate's judgment is basically, I allow it. It's not I mandate it, it's I allow it. And from there, the order to actually crucify Jesus is given by the Jewish leaders, not by Pilate. But they got the Roman charge. He made himself a king, right? They're not under the Jewish law and blasphemy. That's not where they're killing him. They got their way. They got this Pilate, the Romans are killing Jesus, is the narrative that the Jewish leaders get to tell, while they're the ones giving the order to have it done. They won pretty much on all accounts. And now that's it. Jesus is being crucified. And Pilate just got spectacularly outmaneuvered. He's having a very bad morning. But of course, Jesus is having a worse morning. But the difference being, Jesus is choosing this, Pilate is not. This has been an overview of Lesson 22 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, The Gospel According to John, an encounter with grace and truth. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.